Naomi, thanks. Thank you for joining us for today's GINSA webinar. The topic we will be discussing today, how the U.S. can ensure Israel's qualitative military edge. We are honored to have joining us General Chuck Wald, former Deputy Commander of EUCOM, who is a distinguished fellow at GINSA's Gamunder Center and a co-chair of GINSA's Iran Policy Project and Eastern Med Policy Project. We also have GINSA Director of Foreign Policy, Jonathan Rui, and this webinar will be moderated by Dr. Michael Makovsky, GINSA CEO and President. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen or by raising your hand in Zoom. For those in the audience, you're automatically muted and your video is off. Today's topic was recently discussed in an op-ed co-authored by General Wald and Dr. Makovsky titled F-35s to UAE Necessitates U.S. Ensure Israel's QMA, which you can find on the GINSA website. I would like to invite Dr. Makovsky to start this discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Eris. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thanks, of course, to General Wald and Jonathan as well for joining. Now, oops, sorry about that. A little extra drama. My iPad just fell. Let me explain for a minute kind of the context of this piece, and then we'll of the subject, and then we'll start digging into it. First of all, it's a very hot topic right now about Israel's qualitative military edge, as I'm sure you all know. It's been reported that as part of the terrific peace agreement with Bahrain and Israel and UAE and Israel, that the United States had committed to sell the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, advanced F-35 planes. This met with resistance, reportedly, by many in the Israeli military establishment who did not seem to be in the loop of in the negotiations leading up to the peace agreement, which was announced in August and signed a few weeks ago on the White House lawn. Now, the issue of Israel's qualitative military edge has been, people use that term a lot, and I'm just going to define it the way General Wald and I'm just going to frankly read from the op-ed because we spent a bunch of time to writing it, is that people use this term QME, qualitative military edge, and I just want to explain how we understand the term, and Jonathan's going to get a little more into it, but we wrote that it essentially means sustained Israeli military superiority that secures deterrence, and if deterrence fails, then ensures clear, decisive, offensive or defensive triumph at an acceptable cost to itself. So that's how we define that. The issue does not come up in the public realm a lot because it seems a little esoteric to many. But obviously, as I said, it's come up now with the reported U.S. commitment of selling these to the F-35s to Israel. Israel's been concerned not just about F-35s for several years now, but they've also been concerned about all the sales of advanced weaponry to the Gulf states. Now, Jonathan will explain in a bit why the Israelis are so concerned. But we here at GINSA have been focused not only on the Israel's qualitative military edge, basically Israel's ability to defend itself by itself, to put it in a more pithy way, for a number of years now. We started a project 3 years ago, chaired by Admiral Jim Stavridis, former NATO commander, and it includes General Chuck Wald, who's, as Harris said, is a distinguished fellow with us and is a former deputy commander of the U.S. European Command, which includes as part of the EUCOM's AOR, Area of Responsibility, Israel. So Chuck, General Wald has a lot of experience in dealing with Israel from the security standpoint for a very long time. Now, we've been very focused on how to bolster the U.S.-Israel security relationship, on how to boost Israel's ability to defend itself by itself. And we put out our first report in 2018, laying out, frankly, a number of the recommendations that General Wald and I discussed in this op-ed, because our focus, not just on the advanced weaponry in the region, but about the issue of the Iranian threat. Jonathan is going to delineate some of our recommendations here. But frankly, these are issues. Israel's qualitative military edge, Israel's ability to defend itself by itself in a proper way, has been a concern of us for a number of years because of the Iranian issue. The F-35 sale are the expected commitment, or the expected sale of F-35s to the UAE only kind of heightened the concern of Israel. But even if those planes are sold in 6 or 7 years from now, or actually make it to the UAE, which I think it was the U.S. Ambassador Friedman said recently was going to happen. Israel's qualitative military edge has immediate issues right now, just because of the Iranian threat. So it's really the Iranian threat and all these sales of advanced weaponry to the Gulf Arabs, even if they're allies in the United States, have been a concern. Probably the most immediate concern, of course, is the Iranian issue. So I think this sale here, the expected sale, just kind of highlights this challenge of Israel's qualitative military edge. And I'm glad to see a number of members of Congress that have raised this issue recently as well in light of the sale. So that's kind of a broad context I wanted to share of why we wrote this piece, because frankly, I think it's the only piece I've seen written on Israel's qualitative military edge recently, and very concrete recommendations about how to address it. But let me turn to the F-35 issue first, and I want to turn to General Chuck Wald. General, maybe you could explain for people on the Zoom call, what is the F-35? What is it about the F-35 that has raised such concern?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for your leadership. Jonathan and Harris, thank you also for joining. First of all, let me just say this on the QME. I'm a full supporter of that, always have been. And I'll explain why I think Israel's QME is not necessarily threatened by this sale to the UAE, but the F-35 is the only thing common of the F-35 for other airplanes is it actually has wings and engine. And that's the only thing that's similar to other airplanes. It is basically a flying computer. It's got 25 million lines of code in it. Awesome capability to ingest, assimilate, and send data out and act on data. I've talked to a lot of the F-35 pilots that fly it now. One thing about the F-35, by the way, there's only one seat, and there aren't any two-seaters. So the only thing you can fly for people like me is a simulator, but it's fun. But the F-35 is amazing, and the pilots that fly it just cannot believe the difference of how much more capable it is than, say, other airplanes. Couple things. One, the F-22, which was previously the premier fighter, and some people would still say that in the U.S. I've heard F-22 pilots say they wouldn't want to go to war without the F-35 with it, and that's quite a statement, because normally F-22 pilots want to stay away from everybody and have nobody near them. So the F-35 turns out to be pretty much almost like a quarterback. It's going to be able to penetrate into enemy territory, soak up massive amounts of information, assimilate that information, and send it to other people that need it rapidly via data links. It also can send its information from radars to other airplanes that have missiles, and they can fire their missiles on the F-35's radar signal. So it is a game changer. I've read articles and heard from other people some of the activity the F-35 has had already in the Gulf region. They're flying out of UAE as we speak, which is interesting. And of course, Israel has their own F-35 as well, and they've flown it in combat. But one of the missions, the F-35, it does all types of missions. It does air to ground, believe it or not. It does air to air. It does intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. It does escort. It does, you name it. Close air support, like I said. And they've recently escorted some of the an aircraft carrier from the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf. And during one of those escorts, it's purported that during the period the Iranians shot down the Dutch aircraft accidentally. And the word is that the Iranians were so jittery about the F-35 attacking them that they shot the first thing they saw. So it is a significant airplane. People know that military capabilities, and it's going to be a great airplane for Israel for a long time. And so that being said, I will say something that I've always said. I have highest regard for the Israeli military. I think their Air Force is the best Air Force in the world, including ours, from the standpoint of capability, man for man, woman for woman, for that matter. And so the Israelis are never going to be, you can never overcome the QME for the Israeli capability from the standpoint of talent, operational capability, operational experience, concepts of operations. There's none better, period, in the whole world from their size. So the thing that always gives the Israelis an edge is going to be the capability of their military. It's the systems are awesome too. There's no doubt about it. But their military capability, I look back on the Bekaa Valley War, during the Lebanon War, the kill ratio, I think, was in the 90s, 90 to nothing. Matter of fact, they had Lebanese pilots that were ejecting just to being thought by thinking that they were being tracked by Israeli aircraft. They jump out before they even shot at. So the reputation itself is earned, and it's a huge edge. Two is, there's no country or countries out there right now from a traditional conventional military capability that could touch Israel. So the last thing any of the countries that would have new equipment would want to do would be to attack Israel, except the biggest threat is an Iranian threat, because sometimes they lack judgment and would try something stupid, although I don't think they'd try to attack Israel necessarily, unless they have a nuclear weapon. But the real threat is missiles from Lebanon, Hezbollah. And along with that, the F-35 will be able to help detect missile sites, launch sites. There's no better missile air defense capability, none even close in the world, than Israel. They have the layered defenses that are outstanding. So to think somebody's going to attack Israel from the air is, I think, probably ludicrous. But that being said, there are other things that when we export capabilities and technology to different allies, sometimes the exact makeup of those assets, basically how they're outfitted, are different in some countries than others. I will say this: Israel always gets top-notch equipment, top-notch capability, and nothing's held back. But I'll stop there, Mike, unless you have other questions.
I'll come back to you, Chuck. I want to go, thank you very much for that. And I do think I should add, you probably gathered that I should have mentioned, but General Wald is an Air Force general, Air Force pilot for many years, an Air Force general, and obviously been a distinguished fellow with ours, and obviously has been a close friend of mine for a long time. We love having Chuck, General Wald, involved with us, because as you can see, he knows so much. I want to come back to you, Chuck. I want to go to Jonathan. Jonathan, I know that General Wald view about the superiority of the Israeli military, but as we said, I think the Israelis still, the IDF certainly is very nervous, remains nervous about their ability to overcome certain challenges. And I'd like you to explain a little why that is, and then we'll get to some of the proposals that we've recommended about how to address those concerns. Go ahead.
Sure, yeah. So I'll sort of pick up on some of the things, Mike, both you and General Wald have mentioned thus far. In terms of sort of the threat environment that Israel finds itself in, and I would recommend any of JINSA's reports from our U.S.-Israel Security Task Force laying out the strategic context. But as we mentioned, Israel's qualitative military edge is a function of Israel being able to deter or defeat an adversary or potential combination of adversaries in its neighborhood, roughly meaning the broader Middle East. And so what's very important to point out is this means adversaries of Israel, key among them obviously Iran and its proxies, we'll get into in a second, but it's also just a function of the larger strategic balance in the region. Middle East history is especially modern Middle East history, is rather replete with examples of countries that are a friend today and a foe tomorrow, given abrupt changes to regime makeup in some of these countries that border around Israel. And so you can't just use sworn adversaries as the sort of benchmark for determining what poses a threat to Israel's qualitative military edge. It's also simply a back of the envelope calculation, just matching Israel with any other of the countries in the region. And so this is why the UAE becomes especially relevant with the potential F-35 transfer, but also the sort of what we call the moderate Arab regimes around the region that are either openly or under the table cooperating with Israel, or at least willing to maintain a cold peace with Israel. So Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf countries are the main ones that figure in here. And as Mike mentioned sort of at the outset, there is a massive arms race going on in the Arab world. It's not directed at Israel. It's mainly Iran focused, and I would say to a lesser extent Turkey focused, which I'll get into in a second. But three of Israel's neighbors, Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, have been among the world's 5 largest arms buyers in the past 5 years and probably even 10 years. And most of those are highly advanced weapons systems. Most of these countries are willing to spend amply on defense. And so Israel has to factor in, not that the current regimes in any of these countries would ever point those weapons at Israel, but if tomorrow the Egyptian government should fall and again perhaps be replaced with the Muslim Brotherhood government, all of a sudden the naval balance for Israel looks very different in the region than it does today. So the Arab arms race is a big factor here, and certainly one that looked at on paper is threatening to Israel. In addition, you have Turkey, speaking of countries that were yesterday's friend and increasingly today's adversary. Turkey is undergoing a massive arms buildup, not exclusively or even primarily pointed at Israel, but increasingly we've seen Erdogan sort of be willing to distance himself from what used to be very strong Israel-Turkey cooperation, frankly, Israel's best cooperation probably with a Muslim country anywhere in the world. So you have Turkey, you have the Arab arms race, and then obviously you have Iran, as General Wald mentioned. This is not just the potential threat of a nuclear Iran, which would probably be the biggest game changer in terms of Israel's qualitative military edge in its history, but also 130, 150,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon, and also the proliferation of increasingly precise capabilities from Iran to its proxies, chiefly Hezbollah, but also others in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, which were factors that Israel really didn't have to calculate, shall we say, 5, definitely not 10 years ago. So it's sort of, Israel's being buffeted on all sides here by threats, both real and potential over-the-horizon threats that all have to be factored in when calculating QME. And just one final point, all these different factors that I've laid out around Israel, they all sort of compound each other. As Turkey's arms buildup continues, that's impetus for Israel's Arab neighbors to continue their arms buildup. Same goes for Iran. So you almost have an echo chamber where there's an arms race in the region. Israel's almost sort of caught in the middle. So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah. And let me add, I think one other element, which is the strategic, and then let's get to the recommendation. The trigger, the impetus of this project that we started in 2017 with General Wald and Admiral Stavridis is that we saw a region where you had this growing Iranian threat in the region and continuing its nuclear program even after the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. Yet you had an America that was seeking to retrench from the region. And I think whoever wins this next presidential election next month, whether it's President Trump or Vice President Biden, that trend will continue, that the U.S. will retrench. Yet American interests have not changed in the region, and the threat to Israel certainly certainly not lessened. So given that strategic context, we think it was important to bolster the U.S.-Israel security relationship and bolsters Israel's ability to defend itself by itself. Now, I think General Wald's comments earlier shows, I think, some of the challenge Israel faces when it deals with, say, with the Pentagon and a number of folks here about trying to explain why the QME remains a problem for Israel. But as Jonathan said, these threats, they remain very serious threats, and you have a retrenching America. And yet, even if some threats don't seem there, that could change rapidly tomorrow. But the biggest threat, of course, is the Iranian threat with the 130,000 rockets and missiles from Hezbollah. Now let's talk about the three issues, the 5 recommendations we have. And we've done a lot of work, and I'm glad Jonathan brought this up. You should look at our website, GINSA.org, to see a number of our reports on these issues over the last year and over the last few years. But Jonathan, if I could stay with you for a second, and then I'll go to General Wald. Could you explain some of these recommendations we have about how to address Israel's concern for its qualitative military edge, none of which, I may add, would add $1 to the U.S. taxpayer in terms of the cost of, we're not asking for more military assistance for Israel or anything like that. You want to go over that, please, Jonathan?
Sure, happy to. So as Mike mentioned, there's a sort of a suite of recommendations we have that pertain to ways to maintain Israel's QME in this new threat environment. And just to build off what Mike just said, amid U.S. retrenchment, the U.S. isn't really factored into Israel's QME. It doesn't factor in the strategic balance. But as Mike mentioned, as we retrench from the region, it's clearly having an effect on all the actors around Israel and making them partly more self-reliant and partly contributing to this arms race I laid out. So indirectly, the U.S. retrenchment is having an effect on Israel's QME. But to get into the more prescriptive side, as Mike mentioned, there's 5 recommendations. I'm going to give more time to some than others, but I'm happy to address them in follow-up and Q&A. The first one is what we call front-loading. This concerns the MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, that exists between the United States and Israel on U.S. defense assistance to Israel. In bureaucraties, it's called Foreign Military Financing, or FMF, is the backbone of this. And for us, it's what we call, it's part of the centerpiece of U.S. support for Israel's QME. And so this MOU, it's for 10 years. It started in 2018. And it spells out $3.3 billion a year of U.S.
It was signed in 2016 under President Obama.
Signed under President Obama toward the end of his second term. Initially kicked in 2018. Basically spells out $3.3 billion in FMF for Israel, as in addition $500 million a year in missile defense. Now the key thing is Israel has to spend the lion's share of that money and eventually all of it in the U.S. It's not just a gift card for Israel to go shopping where it likes. It's basically effectively a line of credit to buy U.S. defense equipment. It's the largest commitment the U.S. has ever made to an ally in a financial sense. But given this threat environment that I laid out and the fact that the MOU was negotiated, as Mike said, coming on 5 years ago now, signed 4 years ago, the threat environment has changed such that we call for front-loading the remaining funds in that MOU, which are currently spaced out evenly over 10 years. This is so Israel can accelerate its procurement of a lot of the things it's going to need to maintain its qualitative military edge, especially with the arms embargo that's set to lapse on the Iranians this month, and in addition to all the other sort of threats I've laid out, both proximate and longer term. So as Mike mentioned, this wouldn't add $1 to the cost to the United States taxpayer. We lay out, there's a whole range of financing options to do this. I'm happy to go into those in more detail, but essentially Israel could borrow against the money that's spelled out in the future in any number of ways, use it to buy more stuff now and begin onboarding it, whether that's another squadron of F-35s, whether it's new F-15s. The F-15s have traditionally been the workhorse of the Israeli Air Force, and they would possibly need to bring on a new squadron of those, especially given that it'll take time to bring on all the F-35s they want to. Also, potentially KC-46 aerial refueling tankers, key part of Israel's power projection capabilities, and currently somewhere that's frankly kind of dilapidated in their arsenal. As I mentioned, all the money would get spent in the U.S. Eventually, currently the lion's share of it, so it boosts U.S. jobs, and it's consistent with our defense strategy's desire to maintain healthy demand in the U.S. defense industrial base. A separate recommendation that kind of builds off that is with a sense of urgency you have that would drive front loading, start negotiating the next MOU with the Israelis now. The current one it's the third consecutive one dating back to the late 90s. It would be presumably when the current one expires in 2027, there would need to be another one in place by then. So we say it's never too soon to start discussing that. Thirdly, a little bit different area is the issue of what's called pre-positioning. This is what we think is really an underappreciated but core issue in maintaining Israel's QME. And as Mike mentioned, giving Israel the tools to defend itself and thereby defend U.S. interests as we retrench. So this pre-positioning issue concerns an arms depot we have in Israel. It's under U.S. lock and key. Israel pays most of the expenses for the upkeep. We built it in the Cold War to surge U.S. forces into the Persian Gulf when we thought there was a clear Soviet threat to the region. After the Cold War, the purpose has changed a little bit, and now it's more for Israel to have the tools on hand it would need in an emergency like wartime. Think 1973, avoiding a repeat of the massive U.S. airlift across half the globe in the middle of the conflict. Imagine if Israel had sort of an insurance policy of weaponry that all it needed to do is essentially ask the U.S. and take transfer of the weapons that Israel would then pay for. The problem here, and for a whole host of factors, is by and large the depot, which is called WRSAI in Pentagon speak, that currently is full of mostly obsolete weaponry, some we would call dumb bombs that are as opposed to smart bombs that are not precision guided. And given, again, these threats that we laid out, especially the imminent threat from Iran and what we think is a looming threat of a large-scale war, that depot, its intent would be to meet its intent, it would have to have precision-guided munitions in it that the U.S. could use and that Israel could draw from, like I said, in an emergency or wartime, specifically joint direct attack munition tail kits, but also a range of other things I can go into in detail. And so what we recommend is the U.S. replenish and upgrade that stockpile to meet its intent, potentially by taking it from just the current bilateral concept, which is it's in Israel, it's for primarily Israeli use, and it's part of European Command, General Wald used to be deputy of. We recommend making it more of a regional stockpile, reflecting the fact that Israel and countries in Central Command, like Bahrain, like UAE, are now more intertwined on political and presumably future on more defense-related levels. So regionalize the stockpile, make it a place that's more integrated into U.S. military global supply chains, because currently for a whole host of reasons, there hasn't been much incentive for the Pentagon to fill this stockpile up to replenish it, even though that's part of its stated purpose. And I'm happy to go into plenty of detail on that in Q&A. Just two more quick recommendations, and then I'll leave off. One is what we call elevating Israel's status as an ally. We say, Israel should be more like Australia or Great Britain. We've said this for a couple of years now, but especially, in the era of COVID, where we're seeing growing calls for cooperation among democracies, especially those threatened by actions by countries like China, elevate Israel to an effectively, not formally, but effectively a member of the Five Eyes agreement on signals intelligence sharing. Israel's a great collector of intelligence. They've proven to be a reliable ally. Find ways to increase cooperation with Israel in this regard, and also remove some classification barriers that prevent Israel from sharing a lot of information and technology related to American-made weapons they're using. There's a range of classification barriers that prevent better cooperation there. And then just finally, what we call joint high-tech R&D. Wald mentioned Israel's missile defenses as being the world's best. One of those is Arrow, which is U.S. help was pivotal for making Arrow possible. So what's the next Arrow? What's the next game-changing system? So we recommend a whole host of ways to bolster joint R&D. We'll have a paper coming out on this in the near future, looking at things like hypersonics, which are obviously increasingly important for U.S. Global force posture, directed energy, satellites that help find things that are good at hiding but not good at defending themselves, like a lot of these little green men that increasingly we see pop up on battle zones. And then also things like quantum computing, AI, all the things we think of when we think of next generation technology. So there's a whole range of ways to boost QME and help Israel continue protecting power defends U.S. interests. So I'll pause there.
That's good. That's very comprehensive, Jonathan. Thank you. Before I go back to General Walt, I want to have Harris. Do you want to remind folks about how they could ask questions, which will start in just a couple minutes?
Sure, absolutely. You can raise your hand in the hand feature on Zoom, or ask it through Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question, and I'll ask it on your behalf. So
Okay,
those are the two ways.
While people are doing that, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes, I want to go to General Wald. Jonathan covered a lot of items that you and I, General, wrote about in our piece the other week, but I'd like to just kind of zoom in, so to speak, on one of the issues. Look, you were deputy commander of the U.S. European Command, which meant that you really managed it because the commander was in Brussels. General Jones really focused more on NATO. And you then also had the African countries under you before the Africa Command came, right? So you had Africa, you had Europe, you had Eastern Europe, Central Asia under your area of responsibility. How important would you think having a more regional arms depot? We have, like, as Jonathan explained, there's been an arms depot there American arms depot there since the 1980s. But as Jonathan pointed out, a lot of the weapons have become obsolete. How important do you think it would be for U.S. to have a more active, updated arms depot in Israel? I mean, for important, not for Israel, which is obvious, but more for the United States. Given that we use Qatar already, we use Turkey, of course, and Incirlik, of course, as Jonathan pointed out, we have a lot of issues with Turkey. So maybe you could explain from a military standpoint. Thanks.
I actually, first of all, Jonathan, that was a really good rundown. I actually think that issue is one of the most serious QME issues, frankly. And a couple of anecdotes, and then I'll talk a little bit specific about this. But I think there's two major issues for Israel: strategic depth and time. And they do have a broader weapons, not capability, but volume issue that we just outlined that we can talk more about. But two things that come to mind for me. One of them is during the Afghanistan response by the United States against the Taliban, October 7th, 2001, we had had an agreement with Oman for several years, and we're providing the Omanis with funding as basically a guarantee insurance policy that if we needed to, we could use 2 air bases in Oman in the region by calling in the chit. It was $350 million a year. We had paid it for 10 years. 9/11 occurred, and I flew into Oman to ask them to let us go into the airfields in Thumrait and Sib, and I was told we couldn't go there. And the Omanis were good friends. I knew these guys. I said, "What's the issue?" And he said, "We have an exercise coming up with the Brits. We've been planning it for a year. There's 25,000 Brits coming. We need the airfields." I said, "This isn't an exercise. This is for real." And ironically, the United States didn't go to bat, so we had to fly out of Diego Garcia for the first month. That's not a good thing. Two is, we've recently deployed Patriots to Israel. They come and go under a certain training regimen. And the U.S. government was going to move the Patriot batteries out of Europe back to the United States, similar to what they're talking about right now with certain things. And we were able to talk the Pentagon out of having those 2 batteries leave Europe because it's 3,000 miles closer to the fight. So the real issue for Israel, for us, I think, is, again, I'm real high on their capability, as you know. Quantity has a quality of its own, I get that. And you can't really ever say for sure something's going to happen. In other words, you can't say for sure the United States is going to back them up when the time comes. But I'd say it's 99.99999% that will show up. The problem is it takes time. So really Israel has to buy time. They've got to have those weapons in place today to fight tonight. and the prepo is a significant issue. We also talked about tankers for being able to get into Iran if they have to counter strikes or preempt strikes. But I think the prepo that Jonathan outlined is significant, and it would help us as well, because the one thing for sure is Israel and the United States are going to fight with each other against a foe. It doesn't matter who it is. And for us to be able to transport a whole bunch of weapons over there at the beginning of an activity, when we went into Iraq in 2003, the 4th ID out of Fort Hood, Texas, got on boats at Corpus Christi and put all their infantry division heavy armor and weapons on ships. The only thing was there's OSHA standards in the United States, and they had to demate the weapons from the tanks and do separate ships. So it was you could have walked across the Atlantic with all the ships it took to get over there. So I think the prepo is significantly important. I think the updated pre-positioning of weapons that Jonathan talked about, front loading it, both from a cost standpoint and from a strategic reserve standpoint, now is significantly critical to do because of both the time issue, the distance issue, and the logistics situation. And we're going to benefit in the United States just as much as anybody else is. It's basically Israel's, and Jonathan mentioned Five Eyes and et cetera. And I think that's a good point. But from what I've experienced at firsthand from a commander standpoint, and I've flown in and out of Israel a lot, both from an operational standpoint. I've flown in Israel with the Israelis. I've never, ever seen one time where there was any reticence about us doing anything in the country or with them or sharing intelligence. But I think we should formalize that. I think you and I have talked about it before, Mike, about a treaty. The irony is that the people that don't want to have that treaty are the Israelis because they think we might limit them. So I can see that. But I'm bullish on the Israeli capability. I'm bullish on all the recommendations that we put in the report. I think it would be hugely important, not just for Israel, but for us too.
Let me follow up on that real quick, and then we'll go to the question. But you brought up the Mutual Defense Treaty, which has been another issue that JINSA has pushed. Prime Minister Netanyahu has come out in favor of that, and Senator Lindsey Graham in the Congress has been a big champion based on our report, and then President Trump last year also tweeted about his interest in discussing the Mutual Defense Treaty. As you said, Chuck, some of the Israeli military establishment has had reticence about it because they think it might restrict their freedom of movement. We don't believe that. We have separated that issue, I should clarify for the audience, outside of this issue right now of the QME. We think a mutual defense pact between Israel and the United States would be very useful, as Chuck said, for the United States, but also for Israel. For the purposes of this discussion today, we wanted to focus on the pure military elements as opposed to just the deterrent elements. But I agree with you completely, General Walt. I think it's very important. And let me take some questions. I might want to come back to you, Chuck, and ask you just a question or two about what you just said. But I think, Harris, maybe we'll take some questions first.
Yep.
And then.
Absolutely, Mike. We have some really interesting questions and a lot of them. So you guys have done a great job in bringing that out and our supporters. Let's start with the following. How would you categorize Turkey with its current leadership affiliation when it comes to QME, given the fact that Turkey is still a partner in the F-35 project and was a client till the S-400 problem?
All right, so I'm General Walt. Do you want to address that, please?
Sure. I've been around Turkey a lot. I've flown out of Turkey a lot. I've flown with the Turks a lot. I've had them under my command. I'd say the last thing the Israelis need to worry about is Turkish air forces. They're not very good. Number two is the Turks are pretty good on the ground. They've got some volume, so size is of the issue. But I think Turkey is somewhat of a threat, but I don't think they're really a real threat to the homeland of Israel. I think if they augmented, say, a combat situation in Lebanon or something, they would be problematic, mainly because of the numbers. But and the ground guys are pretty decent fighters, but Israel kicked their butt.
If I could just add to that, Harris, let me point out that Erdogan, President Erdogan of Turkey, just said, I can't remember if it was yesterday or the other day, that Jerusalem is ours. The Ottomans built it. Turkey under Erdogan is certainly very aggressive ambitions. They're in Libya. They're doing aggressive things in the Eastern Med, certainly against the Greeks. There are questions of whether they're involved here with the Azerbaijani and Armenian conflict of recent days. But it's a good question about Turkey also when we're talking about the UAE here, because Erdogan came out extremely strongly in August against this peace deal between Israel and the UAE, and really kind of aligned himself unequivocally with the other rejectionists in the region, like Iran and the Palestinian Authority, frankly, and Hamas. Unfortunately, and as the questioner asked about the S-400s, which are Russian, and there was a report I saw today or yesterday that suggested they might have been activated. They've been acting, unfortunately, more like not like a NATO ally, that's for sure, and certainly not a partner of the United States, even though they're former NATO ally. I mean, even though they formally are a NATO ally. But we look forward to the day when the Turks return much more like they used to be.
Okay,
Harris, what's the next?
That's a really important topic. Matter of fact, it's worthy of a whole bunch of papers that you guys have done before. But
we were working on that on Eastern Med. That's right.
Erdogan is a huge problem, and at some point, the West is going to have to face what he's doing. It's problematic for Israel, mainly in the Eastern Med, as you point out, I think, and probably on the flanks a little bit. But their actions, to me, are pathetic from the standpoint of a NATO ally and an ally to the United States. That needs to be addressed. But, you can get enough people together, as Jonathan points out, it isn't one country or another. It could be several countries. Iran and Turkey, different vectors for a threat against Turkey is a problem. There's no doubt about it, especially with Hezbollah's weapons in Lebanon. So I think that's maybe not for this discussion today, but a huge problem.
Yeah, I would encourage the questioner and anyone in the audience. JINSA has been putting out a number of things on the Eastern Med in the last couple of years. And one of our recommendations has actually been bolstering our security relations with the Greeks and lessening our security ties with the Turks. And I'm glad to see that actually the United States, Secretary of State Pompeo was just in Greece recently, and we are going to be stationing a pretty big ship there. And I'm glad to see, and General Walden, Jonathan and I were in Greece last year. We've been there a couple of times, and this is something that we think is very important because unfortunately, the Turks do have their ambitions, but we're seeing how they're treating the Kurds, what they're doing in northern Syria, their support of Hamas, supporting other extremist Muslim groups, their influence on immigration into Europe, which has been extremely, caused a lot of problems. So the Turks are a clear problem, but we'll do a Zoom on that another day. We've done it on other days before. Harris, what's the next question?
This is a topic that, Mike, you were talking about for many years now. What's going on with the bunker busters, and can Israel get them from the United States?
The question is about selling Israel these GBU-57s. There's these massive ordnance bombs that go deep about 200 feet underground for exploding. They require certain planes, which Israel doesn't have really, to fire them. They could be dropped, though, from some plane that Israel does have. As far as I know, that's a good question. I don't believe that that's part of the discussion. And I should add that I think I forgot at the beginning of the show, Israeli Defense Minister Gantz was here in Washington 2 weeks ago, meeting with Secretary of Defense Esper. As far as I know, it's not part of the discussion between the two countries. Go ahead.
I'll
The
just
next-
add this, Mike. There's two different bombs that you're talking about here. One's the 15,000 pounder, and the only thing that can drop that is the B-52. And then there's the 5,000 pounder, which F-15s can drop. It's a good bomb. I think that would be something I would, if I were Minister of Defense Gantz or Prime Minister Netanyahu, I would ask the United States to pre-position the 5,000 pounders in the pre-po we talked about, primarily against deep and hardened buried targets in Iran. Is what if there ever is a conflict in Iran that looks inevitable or needs to be taken on because of the breakout of a nuclear weapon type activity for Iran, that's the kind of weapons you're going to need to take out some of their facilities. With GPS, go ahead.
Chuck, but not the 30,000 pound GBU.
Well, the 30,000 pounders that's the B-52. Actually, the 15, I misspoke. The 15,000 pounder you can drop with a parachute out of a C-130. The 30,000 pound mother of all bombs is a B-52 only. And even the B-2 can't carry it because of the size of the way the bomb bay is set. On the other hand, the B-2 can certainly carry 5,000 pounders. Matter of fact, carry 80 250 pounders, carries 22,000 pounders. So I think having those weapons pre-positioned would be a good idea. Now the B-2, if we ever get after Iran again, or we get after them ever, the B-2 is going to be a primary player for that, and they'll just carry the bombs with them from the United States, just like we did in Afghanistan. And so the only limitation there is it takes 40 hours to get there, but other than that, it's not bad.
Chuck, the B-52 can't carry the big bunker buster, the 30,000 pound bomb?
No, that's the only aircraft that can carry it.
Oh, they can. Okay,
Yeah.
just to clarify.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Harris. What's next?
This is directed towards General Wald. How would you evaluate the UAE's military capabilities, especially compared to its Middle East neighbors?
I think the UAE is the second best military in the region by a long shot. They're professional, they're good. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed is a military mind, man. He was good in the military. He's had great advisors over there from other countries as well, all allies of ours. They're disciplined, they've got great capabilities, they understand how to use them, and they've learned from it. So I think they're obviously not Israel, but they're, let's say, comparison to maybe their neighbor to the west, they're measurably better.
Great. Jonathan, do you have anything to add, or do you?
No, everything I've heard just seconds what General Wald said.
Great. And again, I'm asking questions. Some of this you might not, this group might not want to answer or might not know the answer to, but does the F-35 significantly enhance Israel's ability to deal with precision-guided missiles in Lebanon?
Is that for me or Harris?
Yeah, Chuck.
You mean as far as defending against precision-guided weapons from missiles, I should say?
Yeah, let me ask you the question again. Let me bring it up. Hold on here. Does the F-35 significantly enhance Israel's ability to deal with the PGMs in Lebanon? So I guess deal with would be how you interpret it, how you just said.
Yeah, I'd like to just clarify, I think. So the weapons from Lebanon are surface-to-surface missiles. They're ballistic sometimes. Now they're becoming guided a little bit. And so you wouldn't normally shoot down, you wouldn't even try to shoot down one of those missiles with an airplane. That's why Jonathan alluded to it earlier, the Arrow system, the Patriot PAC-3, the Green Pine radar, probably all the way into David Sling. You don't use Iron Dome against those types of things. That's more of the smaller missiles from the Gaza. But the F-35 wouldn't be necessarily shooting them down with their own weapons, but they could be detecting them for sure with their capabilities. And they could detect the sites for sure with their radar mapping capability and other electronic capabilities. So it would definitely be part of the thing about the air defenses for Israel that's so sophisticated is, first of all, they're very good at what they do, the Israelis, the air defense, they're excellent. Two is it's an integrated air defense system. Everything is integrated together. It's layered, integrated, and they don't just use traditional Patriot radar, let's say, to find a missile or something else. They use all different types of sensors, as well as space sensors. But the F-35 would definitely contribute to that overall layered, integrated air defense capability with the systems.
But if I could add, maybe Jonathan, you want to address this. This one of the threat of those 130,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon is one of the reasons Israel needs so many its own precision guided missiles at the launchers and so on. Isn't that right? I mean, isn't that how is Israel? We wrote a whole report about this a couple of years ago. How is Israel going to deal with this threat, John?
Yeah, thanks. And anyone who's interested, Israel's Next Northern War from October 2018. It has an executive summary. Basically, just given the sheer volume and growing precision of Hezbollah's rocket and missile arsenal, and also you have to factor in whatever Iran's got in Syria, Iraq, and potentially elsewhere. For Israel to deal with this, the best defense will be a good offense. If you have 130,000 rockets and missiles, facing off against, as General Wald mentioned, probably the best air defense system in the world in Israel, simply overwhelm it. Hezbollah, the estimates I've seen is they're going to launch as many rockets in the first 24 hours of the next war as they did in the entire 34-day war in 2006. So Israel's best shot is not to try to absorb and deflect that, although they will try to deflect whatever comes up at them, but rather to take them out before they can be launched on the ground. In Lebanon, for that, you need a fairly capable Air Force and a lot of precision guide munitions to minimize the collateral damage that Hezbollah is intentionally trying to generate by illegally placing these weapons primarily among civilian infrastructure in Lebanon.
Okay, Harris?
The U.S. controls the supply of spare parts and materials for the F-35. Is this sufficient to assure that the UAE will not use the F-35s in any action that the U.S. would oppose?
Chuck?
Is that for Mike or me?
No, Chuck. Chuck.
Okay. There are ways to restrict things, if you will. I mean, obviously, if the UAE were to act counter to the United States and Israel in any way, I think that would really hinder their ability to be resupplied with logistics. We're not going to put up with that. I don't see that happening, but like Jonathan alluded to earlier, you can never predict the future perfectly, so you got to be careful. But there are methods for doing that. So without getting into some of the detail, I'll say there are some things you can do to limit other export capabilities, let's say.
Okay, you guys ready for our next question? Any comments on the new legislation introduced by Representative Schneider in the House to establish more congressional oversight over the deal with UAE?
Jonathan, do you have any?
Nothing perhaps profitable, so I'll pass.
I'll just make one real quick comment. I don't think you need legislation, but if they pass legislation for oversight, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, we transported the ATACMS, which is a long-range, pretty real capable surface-to-air, surface-to-ground, I should say, weapon system the Army has, to Bahrain. And when we sent it there, we sent it under a dual key process where they couldn't have access to it without approval from the United States. It wasn't just physical, or it was physical, but it was an approval process. And there's certain codes and things you have to get to make those work. They weren't going to get the codes unless we approved it. So there are ways to do certain things. I don't purport myself to be a UAE expert. I've been there a lot. I have a lot of friends there. I've probably been there 50 or 60 times. I ran the part of the war in Afghanistan out of there and other things. I know the Emiratis very well. And again, the leadership could change at some point, and the attitudes could change at some point, I suppose. But there are different things we can do as the United States to safeguard bad behavior. Right now, it doesn't look like there's going to be bad behavior. It looks like they're going to behave very well.
So why don't I ask one more question, Mike, and then I'll pass it back to you. It's almost 4 o'clock. Actually, time has flown. But this is an interesting question about will Israel be able to get both the additional 25 F-35Is and 25 F-15IAs they want? Also, will they be able to upgrade the current F-15I and F-15IA capabilities?
Well, I can make a real quick comment on that, and Mike, I'm sure, wants to. But the limitation, if you will, limiting factor on the F-35 right now is how many you can build. So Israel's high on the list of getting F-35s. There's no doubt about it. It looks like Turkey might help them a little bit, so we're not going to sell F-35s to Turkey when they get the S-400. But I think the upgrades, I can't think of anything in the U.S. that we ever had that they didn't have access to, the Israelis, in some way, or at least promised access during conflict. The other irony about the question is that the Israelis are sometimes better at upgrading their systems than we are. And there's, there used to be almost it wasn't a joke, but it was kind of a frustration amongst U.S. pilots that, well, darn it, the Israelis have upgraded that capability and we don't have it yet. So the Israelis are, as you know, probably as good technologically as anybody in the world. They got great capability. And so I don't think they're going to be limited by technology limitations of any sort. The F-35 the Israelis have will be as good as the F-35s the U.S. has.
Okay. There's.
Yeah, Mike, I think why don't I pass it back to you for closing comments?
I appreciate it. I'll just say that I appreciate everyone joining. Obviously, this is a very important time on this issue to discuss the qualitative military edge. It's come about, I think, at least it's come to the fore a bit because of the expected proposed sale of UAEs to the F-35, F-35s to UAE, which we discussed today. But whether that sale goes through or not, which I expect it will, but this issue of Israel's qualitative military edge and how to, again, I think the issue of the UAE, they're getting planes, at least according to Ambassador Friedman, it's going to be a bit, 6 years, maybe 7 years. The immediate issue remains for Israel, their major threat, the most immediate threat, the most concrete threat, is the Iran issue. And I think all those of us certainly who believe in a strong U.S. And believe in a strong Israel and a strong U.S. bilateral security relationship, I think we got to do whatever we can to try to mitigate Israel's concerns about its QME and really try to do whatever we can to boost its ability to defend itself by itself. And if it can, unfortunately, do that, God forbid, then we also think there should be a mutual defense pact. But I should just say I encourage everyone to continue looking out in your emails for things that we're going to be putting out. This has been a focus of ours for the last few years. And it's not just an academic exercises. We're in touch, not only on the Israeli side with senior IDF folks and in Ministry of Defense folks, but also with senior government officials here, certainly on the national security side on this issue. So keep looking out. We think it's important not just to talk about these issues, but to lay out very concrete recommendations about how to address them. So I hope you'll read the op-ed that General Walden and I wrote. Look at the reports that we've been putting out. Look at gensa.org for that, and look out for future things, reports, op-eds, and so on, and discussions like this that we're going to be having and issuing. So I want to thank General Wald for his time today and for sharing his comments and for being a key part of GINSA for many years, and also Jonathan, he's our policy director, for sharing his comments today and all the hard work he does on this issue. I want to thank everyone in the audience. And Harris, also thank you for organizing this and moderating, and thank everybody on the Zoom today. And look forward to being in touch by Zoom. Can't see you, but in future Zoom calls and so on. Thank you very much, everybody. Stay healthy.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.